Hello, my name is Gary Spiteri. I'm a senior system engineer with Cortex based out of Sydney, Australia. And welcome to another episode of the Cortex Dialogue. Today's dialogue is all about zero trust. And for that reason, I've got Australia New Zealand's absolute specialist in zero trust. It's a passion of the gentleman I'm about to speak to. I want to introduce you all to Riccardo Galbiati, who is, well, when I knew him, he was actually still a humble SE, very passionate about zero trust at the time, but now he's the field CTO for Australia New Zealand. And Riccardo, I'll bring you in here. Is zero trust everything that you think about now, or dare I say that you're still considering the SOC and the relationship between zero trust and the SOC?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Thank you, first of all, for having me. As you said, zero trust is a passion of mine, but I also like dialogues and Cortex. So the two other elements that we're bringing to the conversation today are very close to my heart. And I do believe that zero trust is still widely misunderstood, and in some cases, not well placed when we talk about the SOC. People maybe don't think that the SOC has anything to do with zero trust, while I believe it's probably at its very core. Because I think if we really think about the relationship between zero trust and the SOC, well, first of all, what are we trying to achieve with zero trust? Well, we have the epitome of zero trust would be to remove implicit trust from all our networks and endpoints and clouds, and making sure that we have full context awareness when we allow for digital interactions. And these awareness is generated by tools and capabilities that we deploy in all these locations, but they all converse back to the SOC. So the SOC is that central point that takes probably the results of all these activity happening in the various zero trust tools, and it has the ability to, first of all, correlate and maybe see those unseen patterns, because it's easy to maybe identify one event in a single location, but if you don't correlate it to something that's happening somewhere else, then you don't have the full visibility that you're trying to achieve. And ultimately gives back to zero trust. So there's a give and a take type of relationship. It gives back because we can then remediate or automate or improve our policies back into those zero trust tools. So I think SOC and zero trust get along pretty well.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you're speaking there, you were hitting a whole bunch of different buzzwords that really strongly resonate with me. Context, automation. You're talking about that broad collection of data. You almost, in some ways, spoke about the role of the Cortex data lake and the fact that it becomes a central repository for the collection of data. It's interesting because in my way of thinking, when I look at the zero trust matrix that we communicate as the architecture, I see it as essentially a series of different contexts. In other words, the application or the user or the transaction. All of these are different contextual viewpoints of a certain part of the conversation or the trust itself. And then also we've got control planes in terms of can we actually do something about this at the infrastructure? Can we do something about this at the identity? Can we do something about this at the transaction? And so you're right. The SOC is that middle ground of taking in that broad-based telemetry, looking at it, monitoring it. Monitoring and that analysis is such a close thing to Cortex XDR's heart in particular. And then once we know that something is wrong, or we've monitored it, I think coming back into pushing down a response is really interesting. And I think that comes to the point, and implicit trust, it almost sounds like a switch. It almost sounds like it's a one-time kind of decision, like I trust you. Is trust actually a one-time thing, or is it actually ongoing? Because I feel that XDR in particular and the role of analytics in monitoring trust is a very important capability, I think. And do you think that zero trust is actually enhanced with analytics and that monitoring of the transaction after a trust has been established?
Yeah, so I'd be careful in saying trust being established. That's one thing that I normally mention to customers because sometimes people think that achieving zero trust meaning knowing what to trust. In reality, it's more about you don't want to specifically trust a conversation or an interaction. You want to evaluate it for what it is at that moment in time, extracting as much context as possible and deciding if to allow it. Now, allow it doesn't mean trusting. And I know that I get a lot of pushback sometimes when I talk about this because it sounds very paranoid. And people tell me, well, zero trust doesn't work well in my organization because people think that I'm paranoid with them and people don't feel trusted. But it's not about people that we're talking about here. It's about technology. And unfortunately, I can trust and I should trust all my colleagues and employees, but I shouldn't trust the devices they use.
Yeah.
Not because they're doing something wrong with them, but because someone could be using those devices against the organization or those people as well. So that's where the zero trust comes from, not to be confused with the people element at all. But going back to that, is it a continuous exercise or is it a one point in time type of evaluation? Well, it has to be continuous. And I think because interactions to digital assets are continuous, you normally don't access the information once and then you're done with it. You keep interacting with it, you keep editing it, you keep accessing applications in multiple locations. So having that constant visibility and feed and loop back feed back into the SOC that tells me, yes, all these interactions in a continuous way have been rightfully evaluated and allowed is how to do zero trust.
Right. So that's an interesting point. And you mentioned about the endpoint as well. And I think there's an interesting illustration of that, and it begs the question about whether the endpoint should actually be the place to start zero trust, because I think, I'm going to trust this device, I'm going to trust this endpoint, but once you start going down that slope, it's like, well, there's almost this concept of a macro trust and a micro trust in terms of I might trust this device or trust this machine. But if you do that, you've just implied that you're trusting every single user and every single application which is on that endpoint, which may or may not be such a good thing, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, I'll come to the role of automation in a moment, but since we're scratching this at the moment, if we were introducing zero trust, I mean, is the endpoint actually a good place to start, or it almost feels like I'm changing my mind whether it is or it isn't such a good thing to do. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It's a valid question. As we said, zero trust can be applied to different scenarios. Now, one thing to remember is the ultimate goal of zero trust, which is effectively to provide a strategy to cybersecurity that limits material breaches. So if we think about that as a strategic first goal of zero trust, we should probably focus on what is a material breach related to. And normally it has to do something about the critical assets or the most regulated type of information that any organization is storing. And that normally does not live on the user endpoint. I assume that when you refer to endpoint, you're talking about, laptops or mobile devices that users take with them and operate on a daily basis, but also servers, workstations, and so on. Now, normally the information that we're really caring to protect is considered the crown jewel and has a high degree of sensitivity. Now, that's where zero trust should start. So focusing there. But there is a case to be made on endpoint devices given to users because they normally are utilized as an entry point. As we know, if you compromise a user machine, that could be your initial step into the rest of the organization. And there is a lot of implicit trust on those endpoints. And I like that analogy that you brought up about, well, if we trust the entirety of an endpoint and we say, here you go, employee, this is your device, it's trusted, you can use it. It's very similar to the concept of perimeter security that we are trying to fight as well. And that was the origin behind where zero trust came from. If we think of perimeters, you create a perimeter and then you put everything trusted inside and everything untrusted outside. You realize that you're giving way too much permission inside that perimeter, similarly to what's happening on the endpoint. because the endpoint might run malicious applications, and even the applications that you trust, as in you install as part of your SOE, could be exploited because they might become vulnerable without you noticing, and then someone exploits them again against those users. So yes, there is a lot of implicit trust on the endpoint. I wouldn't classify it as the first place to start, but it has to be considered in the journey that zero trust is.
Yeah, I think there's an interchangeability between, I mean, my background was IPS IDS, and so being in that way, I'd never think of things in terms of perimeters, but I'd see things as trust boundaries. But you're absolutely right. You know, you wouldn't necessarily put, say, BYOD devices in the same trust zone, so to speak, as your crown jewels. That's just crazy. I mean, that's a very simplistic illustration of you know, having a really bad zero trust architecture in itself. But I think the architecture is really important. I think what you're saying is, and you know, and I'd love to hear your input. You know, a lot of times when you look at either a network architecture and so on, it can actually be quite flat once you've gone past certain access policies or certain VLANs and so on. Am I starting to get closer to where we need to start thinking about zero trust and off of that, you know, looking at the data which is in those different trust domains, so to speak, and being able to have that holistic view across those different domains? It's a different thing, isn't it? You know, you think, oh, I need to police this perimeter. I think, yeah, the word perimeter needs to take a step back, I think, from this. What do you think?
Yes. So if we're talking about network security, obviously for me, perimeters are legacy, and that can sound controversial considering that Palo Alto Networks was born out of technology that was securing the perimeter with the next generation firewall. But we have expanded from that, and we know that next-gen firewalls make sense in some places, in some locations, but they shouldn't be used as perimeters because that would bring that implicit trust concept into the organization. And if we associate that analogy to something that Cortex does very well, for example, on the endpoint, as we said, users access, using their endpoint are trusted to do so, but we should monitor if they fall for a phishing link or for an exploit or clicking on the wrong attachment of an email that then generates maybe the installation of malware. So then we could monitor if we are trusting any application running on that endpoint. We shouldn't. So we should make sure that we verify which application should be running or not based on the fact that it could be malicious. And even the ones, as I said before, that are considered as trusted, so your word reader or PDF reader, they could be exploited. So we shouldn't automatically assume that they are trusted. And Cortex does that very good job of assembling all these patterns of behavior from the user to the application to the possibility of an exploit, and is able to tell you the full story of what is happening over there. And it does that by correlating and all these events, by correlating, by the way, also what happens on the network with that endpoint. And I'm sure that we can keep talking about this forever because there are so many entry points that Cortex can feed from in order to generate those alerts and incidents from.
I think it's a really interesting point you raised about the role of the application, because I think, we use the word malware, very easily, but we forget that malware actually stands for malicious software. But the thing is, it's still software. And we look at today's types of advanced threats, and sometimes it's about the operating system or legitimate applications which are literally just being used in a malicious way at that certain time. So it comes back to some of the things you said at the very beginning. Context. So it's the context of the user, it's the context of the application's use at the time. All of these things, I think, come back and feed that zero trust conversation, which means, again, the underpinning of the collection of data about the user, about the device, about the application, feeding the context with which we can then build out that zero trust framework, so to speak. It's interesting, I think, circling back to analytics, it's something that jumped out at me as we were speaking just then. Cortex has actually innovated with a new type of analytical model, which is actually a global application analytics. So if we think back to SolarWinds, for example, where a legitimate, trusted piece of software, which essentially was running with a privilege of the use of it. SolarWinds was basically used by IT administrators and so on. Or if you go back further, NotPetya and so on, which was essentially, targeting an accounting software that was used by accounting companies in the Ukraine. We're seeing the adversaries understand the association between applications and the trust of the role of the privilege of that particular user. I think they're thinking about things in that blended way, as opposed to thinking about things as perimeters, much more than we do. So this analytical model that we've now introduced is actually doing a global analytics anomaly detection on legitimate applications, and we're able to spot whether the global population of the application, a little bit of it starts turning bad. And we've got now an engine that can actually detect applications that are being injected with malware during the software update process. So in other words, we've got application software, supply chain detection, which is amazing as another way of thinking about zero trust. Are we trusting this application all the time, or do we monitor the application all of the time? And I think potentially that's an analogy that we can then apply to the rest of the architecture of the user and so on as well. Would you agree with that?
It sounds amazing. I honestly can't wait to see it in action, actually, because I think there are a few things that are still very hard to identify when we talk about not trusting elements of your infrastructure or of your applications. And one of them is that supply chain. As we said, unless you're in control of that supply chain, unless you are actually able, and we have, for example, a whole set of other product line to take care of that in the Prisma Cloud element, but unless you're able to monitor what goes in and out your development lifecycle, as soon as you start utilizing an application, you are trusting it. And that's exactly what happened with SolarWinds. And who would have thought that something that you put at the core of your organization could be used to then move laterally with you not realizing it was happening under your nose, because you were trusting it. It's a bit of the let's say the 21st century Trojan horse, right? So there's no way around it. And probably the best way is the anomaly detection. So anomaly in analytics, I would say there's probably two elements of it. One is the one you said, you would see the application behaving abnormally on the endpoint or where it's installed compared to the global population of the world. And the other one, because I've been asked this question before, is yes, specifically referring to SolarWinds. SolarWinds' purpose is to connect to other devices because it monitors them. So how would you identify that it's doing something anomalous? Well, probably because of different patterns, different type of content that is being transmitted between the SolarWinds server and its destination. Again, it's an anomaly detection that does not meet the context that the application was designed to do. And so it would be caught by a zero trust policy. So it all plays together on the endpoint, on the network. As we know, we are approaching this zero trust framework in a platform way. And that's why we have been successful.
Right. Yeah, absolutely spot on. So to close out the conversation, I think we need to mention automation. And I think so much of what we've spoken about, the advanced threats and so on, things are attacking us at machine speed. And so, at Cortex with automation, we think that we need to respond at machine speed because we're being attacked at machine speed. What do you think is the role of automation within Zero Trust itself? Because it sounds like we need to potentially make a decision, and that decision has to be architectural wide or systemic, and make that almost like a systemic response. What do you think about automation and Zero Trust?
I think we're going to see a shift towards automation more and more in the next few weeks, months, and years, for sure. We had this kind of concept that automation was an aid to human, but in the SOC, we should probably reverse that kind of equation and think of that automation should come first and humans should interact when needed. That will help majorly because the majority of the tools that operate in a zero trust context can be automated and should be automated to a point up until we can make, or we can call in a human to decide if the final push of a configuration should be approved. But all of the manual work should be done in advance. And I think Nir Zook, our founder and CTO, has said very rightfully that in the majority of cases, when you have a breach that has compromised the entire organization, you do an investigation about what happened there, and you start collecting telemetry, data, and forensics for weeks, if not months, and eventually you find out exactly what happened and how it could have been prevented. And the question comes, well, if all this was managed by tools and machines, why couldn't we have done that work in real time?
Yeah.
And prevented that in real time using that automation. And I think that's where we're going, right? Even the recent launch of XIM from Palo Alto Networks is aiming exactly at driving that autonomous SOC to deliver outcomes that are beyond anything that was possible before.
Absolutely. And I think that, you've hit the nail on the head. The data is there. We may be either collecting the right data, but we're not either putting it in one place, collecting all of it together. That's a Cortex Data Lake, an XDR capability. The analysis of that data, that's absolutely a analytical capability that Cortex DR has got as well. Integrating the data together, but also integrating the tools so that it sets up automation that can be architectural wide. And so in other words, when you do make a trust decision, or the analytics actually says that something is now needs to change its trust, it's done decisively and with purpose.
And I would add to that, Gary. You mentioned the data lake, and sometimes I get asked, where do we start with zero trust in general? And that normally is that prioritization question. What do you care about securing first? But if we're talking about the SOC, I think the basic building block for a SOC that operates in a zero trust framework is to build that unified data lake. You want your telemetry, your logs, your threat data to end up in a single place, because analytics only work when you have good data and you have a lot of it. So you need to be able to centralize it and then do something with it, and hopefully do that in the most automated way.
Yep. Amen. And I think I will just end on that point by emphasizing that you mentioned telemetry, and this is not about taking just the alert, because the alert basically is telling you that something was wrong. But the fact is that that's not enough within zero trust. You need the actual telemetry. You need the surrounding context, the what's going on all of the time. That, to your point, I think I'll take that as a real takeaway, that it starts with data, it starts with telemetry, and putting it in that consolidated place becomes the basis with which we can start thinking about zero trust in an organization. Ricardo, look, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate the chat. And to the viewers out there, I hope this was an informative conversational dialogue. With that, Ricardo, thank you again.
It's been a pleasure, Gary. Always great chatting with you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is Gary Spiteri. Thank you very much for viewing.